Next, let's look at case selection. Case selection is one of the key decisions in study design, so we will devote quite some time and attention to it in this session. It involves the decision whether to have even a dedicated case or not. There are certainly studies that choose to not be linked to any specific case or not treat the case that you could say it treats. Don't treat it as a case. Even if your study is a single country study, for instance, you may or may not view that as a case study of that specific country. You will have to decide whether you want to conduct a single case or a multi-case study. So there's lots of good points to stick with a single case and explore that and its contexts in depth, contextualize a lot. But a multi-case study allows you to include contrasts, to check back whether patterns you see in one case also occur in another, allowing you to gain other and additional insights. So that's always a trade-off between how deeply do you contextualize one case and how much does it help you to have other cases, sometimes even many other cases. You need to decide whether you have a nested structure of cases or a straightforward single level structure of cases. For example, do you conduct your research in specific municipalities that are part of a specific province, that are part of a specific state? That would be 3 levels. Municipality level is there are cases, they are nested. Several cases are bundled in a superordinate case at the province level, and you have other provinces that also have their municipalities, and even more superordinate, you have the state in which the provinces occur. And you can do that in different countries, so you have 3 layers of cases. And you have to decide how cases on the one hand and units on the other hand relate. And to make that clear, a case is an analytical structure, so something you want to see as a comprehensive analytical whole you can make statements about. Whereas units more specifically relate to things your measurements are assigned to. So you measure at the unit level, but not necessarily at the case level. So you may have several units for one case and they all have their measurements. And if I want to say something about the cases, I need to aggregate the units to the case in some way. So if we have 1 unit per case, they overlap in a sense, or they coincide. We have a case that's at the same time a unit where the measurements are located. But they can also deviate. So we have 1 country as a case, but we survey 1,000 participants in a survey in that country. So those are the units for which we record the measurements. Sampling decisions and considerations and time considerations are also part of the decision making when it comes to case selection. Okay. So what's the purposes of case selection? That is a very important question to ask yourself. What do you want to achieve with selection of a case? There are two main purposes of case selection that can differ in their priority. The first one is to create a microcosm of a larger universe of cases. So that's very much the same logic as in sampling that I treat in a separate unit. So we want the cases to stand for something in as appropriate a way as possible. They should be a microcosm of the larger cosm of the larger universe. The second and often more important consideration is to ensure that we have variation on the variables of interest, meaningful variation between cases. So we can have variation within cases if there are several units per case or sub-cases within the case. So those can create variation within the case, but there's also the cross-case variation, and that can be designed in the case selection process. So meaningful variation in potentially meaningful dimensions, just generally, but we can also be more specific. We could want meaningful variation on the y. That is absolutely necessary. So if the dependent variable doesn't have any variation, what we want to explain, then we can't really explain something, because we need to see differences in order to trace it back to something leading to outcome 1 in one case and the opposite outcome in the other case. Okay, so there needs to be variation on y. But we also need variation on x, the independent variables. So the possible causes you want to explore also can't be the same in all cases. You can restrict the variance and say, we only want high-income countries, for instance, if you're selecting countries. But still, though, within the high-income countries, there is differences in the income, in the degree of income. And that's more optional. You could also want to have meaningful variation in mediating, moderating, and control variables, so to say third variables that could be responsible for a relation or involved in a relationship between x and y and lead to us not seeing that relationship or seeing it even though it's not really there, or helps us understand why it sometimes pops up or not. So meaningful variation based on presumptions we have about the cases or prior knowledge we have about the cases. So we may know characteristics of certain countries, characteristics of certain schools we want to include in a study of school performance, right? And we can use that prior knowledge to select cases that create the kinds of contrasts and variations that will be helpful to us. Good. Going back to the concept, the very concept of case and its relationship to units, I would like to zoom in a little bit on that, because you need to be really clear in that regard. Delineating case from unit is very important, because that's also the difference between case selection on the one hand and sampling on the other hand. In principle, cases and units have in common that they are examples of something. They both represent a larger universe of cases or of units, respectively. Unless units and cases are really the same, I talked about that before, we have a structure where units are nested within cases. So we have either one unit per case or several units per case, but never one unit that belongs to several or that has several cases below it, so to say. Cases are always the higher level unit. though it might potentially be that one unit can belong to several cases. That's not such a structure is absolutely possible. Okay, then a unit, which would be a part of a sample, is the entity for which measurements are recorded. They can sometimes align with the case, but often there are also multiple units per case. Okay, so we need to be very clear about that. Countries, for example, as cases, and individual respondents within the countries as units, as in a cross-national survey. What I talked about before, we could in principle have one person that's a citizen of two different countries and is in each of the countries when the survey is being run, and accidentally the same person is included in two different countries. Then one unit is shared between two cases. That is absolutely possible and not really a problem. What makes this distinction between cases and units sometimes a bit vague is that often researchers talk about units as cases, causing confusion, because for them their cases are units and they are the same thing, so they don't really need to make the distinction. Defining units, just as the cases, is in the end at the researcher's discretion, so they can decide what they want to view as a unit and what they want to view as two different units. Often you want units to align with a natural perceptual border, so two different persons are of course two different units, which makes sense, but in principle you could also try to put several people into one group and record measurements by the group at the group level, so you create an artificial unit that doesn't immediately align with the natural borders. Examples would be that in a survey it's usually useful to define individual respondents as units, but in a panel survey, talked about that in another session, what a panel survey is. So you ask the same persons several times at different points in time. So in a panel survey, you don't define the individual respondent as a unit, but the individual interview. So you record the same things in all three different interviews for the same person, but at different times, so you can track changes. Changes, for instance, in political ideology over a 1-year period with 3 measurements. And I can see what happens, and there my unit needs to be the interview, and I can have the respondent as a case that bundles these 3 units. So respondent is superordinate unit, because we can also assign measurements to that respondent at the respondent level, and it can at the same time be a case, because it's an analytical structure. To visualize that, cases as analytical structures bundling measurements can be immediately tied to individual units, where units are the measurements, where the measurements are being recorded. Or we have several units per case, like 4 units here and 4 units here for case number 2. What does it mean that a case is an analytical structure? The case is, as I already said, an example of something standing for a larger population of cases that a study chooses to analyze more intensively. So that, of course, differs between different kinds of case studies. If you only have one case, it is very intensive and very contextualized. Whereas when you have lots of cases, of course, you can't zoom into each and every single case to the same degree. But the thing is, the case has a context that allows you to use it in an analytical way to learn something about reality. And also cases, just like units, are defined at the researcher's discretion, which often aligns with a natural border. So distinctions already made in the social world by someone else. Somebody has founded an organization. Somebody else has founded another organization. They are listed in some Wikipedia article about this type of organizations. So we take up that distinction and we define different organizations as different cases. We can just agree with that and use it as it is. That's not a natural law, but units and cases differ in the scientific approach to them. So cases are often viewed as something more complex than units. Units, you just amass some of them and use them as you find them, whereas cases have their background story. They require more background and context knowledge to get the most out of the analysis. Sometimes you also need special expertise. If you, for example, want to include a new country into a comparative study of news reporting about school shootings, you usually need someone in your research team that speaks the language of that country. Otherwise, you can't really analyze the news reporting. And even if you have a translation software that works well, you often need the background, the cultural background of the country to really understand what's going on. So even if Portugal would be a good case, you may have to settle with a less optimal solution if there's nobody with a Portuguese background, and even someone from Brazil with good command of the Portuguese language may lack the cultural background knowledge to include Portugal as a case, or to keep it comparable with the other cases where you have the background knowledge. That means that for lots of practical reasons, it's often not really possible to include all theoretically interesting cases into a study. The most existential limitation being that cases may just not exist. Example, you want to analyze the difference in news depiction of school shootings in the US and in Norway. But there haven't occurred any school shootings in Norway as far as I've researched for this lecture as of August 2nd, 2024. So the case design here would be a two-layer design, countries and school shooting cases, which are nested within the countries. Then we would have units. That would be the news report, which could be collected for each school shooting, which is the lowest level case, the school shooting incident. So if we go to the Norway case, we may have to go with the shooting at Utøya, which is probably the closest event to a school shooting that has occurred in Norway as far as I'm aware of. And then we would study different news reports about that case B1, Norway, Utøya. But for the US, we have plenty of cases to pick from. Case A would be the US, and case A1 could, for instance, be the Robb Elementary School shooting 2022. We have news reports about that. Northern Arizona University 2015, and Delaware State University 2007. So with this setup, we would have 3 cases from the US, but only 1 case from Norway. And of course, we're happy that no such incidents have happened in Norway in the past. But for comparability's sake, it's suboptimal that there's only 1 case, and that's not even a good fit to compare with 3 cases from the US, and you could pick like 25 or so cases from the US without problems. Okay, good. So this is an example of a 2-layered case selection with multiple units per case. Good.